And BCube Sunday Morning is always fun on the second Sunday of the month because Tom Whitmore does something spectacular. And what he does is he brings in guests that there's the best word to describe them is spectacular. So, Tom, what spectacular guests do you have for us this week, and what are you going to talk about?
Well, the guests we have this week are Laura Ann Gilman, famous novelist and writer of all sorts of cool stuff. I've always enjoyed her writing. And we have David Boop, who is also well known, has another novel coming out shortly. We're going to talk about Weird West and why people are interested in it and what the perils are of writing it in today's political climate. So
Well, then
I'll let them each say something about what they're interested in talking about.
well then tell you what, let me say something very quickly. I'm turning the show over to you, Tom.
Well, that was quick.
He booked out
So,
of here.
Laura
Yeah.
Ann, introduce yourself.
Oh, God, you
Beyond
need
what
me
I
to go first. Hi, Laura Ann Gilman. As you said, author of many things. I've written fantasy, I've written mystery, I've written romance, I've written horror, I've written combinations of all thereof. And I know I got tapped for this because of the Devil's West stories, which square in the middle of Weird West, involving three novels, one novella, a handful of short stories about what would happen if the Louisiana Purchase had never happened and that entire territory remained wild and magical. Which I wrote mainly because I had already done all the research for my bachelor's degree as a history major, and I figured I might as well use it.
So, David.
Hi, I'm David Boop. I'm a Denver-based author and editor. I'm mostly known for editing the Weird Western anthologies for Baen, and that's straight out of Tombstone, straight out of Deadwood, and straight out of Dodge City. I'm currently doing space westerns for them, of which 2 are out, and the 3rd will be out next year. And then I have my novel that came out last October, The Drowned Horse Chronicle, Volume 1. It is a mosaic novel set in the Old West, where a cursed town brings your inner demons to life as actual monsters. And those monsters tend to be culturally specific because, studying the West, as like Laura has, when we moved west, we didn't just bring our belongings with us. We also brought our fears, our mythologies, our legends. So if you're in a cabin in the middle of nowhere and you hear a thump in the middle of the night, if you're Irish, that's going to be a different monster than if you're from South America, if you're from Asia, from stuff like that. So I wanted these monsters not to be just the classic monsters. I really dove into some of the more obscure mythologies for each of the cultures that I have in the story.
If I can just jump in here,
Yeah.
I'm gonna anyway. David raises one of the more interesting aspects of writing Weird West, for me at least, in that historically, traditionally, we have this Hollywood presented image of the West as being white settlers and native tribes. And white, as usual, tends to default to Western European.
Right.
And it wasn't.
No.
Historically, the West was a crazy quilt of everyone who was showing up. I wrote one of the stories that I wrote for Devil's West was called Boots of Clay. And it's a story of what happens when Jewish settlers from Eastern Europe who have been basically kicked out encounter a native tribe.
Right.
There are no traditionally white people in this story.
Right.
I got emails telling me that there had been no Jews in the Old West.
There are no Jews in America. No.
At which point I was kind of like, go into your closet. Do you have a pair of jeans in your closet? Are they Levi's?
Mm-hmm.
I did not say that. I thought that really loudly, though.
Mm-hmm.
which led me to be like, okay, you're offended by this, you're surprised by this, I'm going to do more of that now. Because
So
hi, have you met me?
Yeah.
But it really is fascinating. People are there's this idea that if you bring in a non-Western European culture into your West, that somehow you're doing something that's on the fantasy side. I'm like, no, that's the history part.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I was doing the anthologies, it was my dictate to make sure that we looked at the West from all the different angles. It's not all white men on white horses with white hats, right? So when I pulled my authors, I pulled from a very diverse background. There is a Jewish Western in one of my anthologies, written by Eitan Collin, called Rabbi Shlomo Jones and the Half-Baked Kid. And I have Asian, and I have Native American, and Stephen Graham Jones gave me the most horrific and beautifully written Native American legend that he just made up, that I've ever read. It's I'm like, where did you find this? And he goes, I made this up. I said, I've read every Native American legend, and this sounds so real, and dark and disturbing, and I loved it. But yeah, it's important, because if you're going to explore a topic, you can't look at the topic from one direction, right? That's what critical analysis does. We have to look at it from different directions if we're to truly understand that topic. And the West is not just one-sided.
There were an awful lot of controversies in the West as we were settling, too. Mm-hmm. The whole slavery, both pro and anti, and the question of whether the territories would become slave or free.
Yeah.
When I was doing research for the Devil's West books, one of the things I did was drive through Kansas, because I'm a firm believer, when I can, of boots on the ground to get a feel for what I'm writing, especially if some of my readers are going to live there. And I started talking to this young woman at one of the motels, definitely a motel we stopped at, and I made a reference to Bloody Kansas. We're in Kansas. She had no idea what I was talking about. So I got to put my history professor hat on and found everything that she hadn't learned in high school. But it's right there in the history.
Would you give us a short précis of that, because I'm sure that a lot of our listeners
I can't. There's no way to do a short version of that. Basically, Kansas was one of the battlegrounds of slave state or free state, and people had opinions.
Yes.
That's a very concise way of doing that. My stories take place, the Drowned Horse stories take place in Arizona, specifically the Verde Valley, which I lived in on and off for about 30 years. And so, when I started doing the actual research, so this is a funny thing. This is the funny thing about being a writer. When you start off as a baby writer, you, as Laura was saying earlier, you just put cowboys and Indians in a Western, right? But as I got better as a writer, I realized that was not good enough. I needed to know what Indian tribes were there. And so I started studying. The more I studied, the more I realized how little I actually knew about Arizona. So if you could see it, there's like 2 bookshelves here, and I've got 2 at the office of just books about the West, mostly focused on Arizona, a lot of them on the Yavapai tribe, which is the tribe that's in that area. The Apache and the Yavapai are the 2 tribes. And but going again off of what Laura said, there's actually a record of when the first Black person crossed into Arizona. I mean, officially, we don't know if some were not on the books, of course, but the first registered Black person in Arizona. And it was such a big deal that somebody made a note of it in history, right? That's huge, right? So as I'm writing, I now know it's like, okay, at this point forward, we start seeing more Blacks in the Arizona territory, right? But before that, it was, I mean, very much a Confederate leaning state. And, you know,
For
don't know
for
how
the
much
Devil's
it's
West book,
changed.
I was writing
Yeah.
set much earlier. Those stories range over several hundred years, but
Mhm.
the third book is set in what would have been Louisiana, and doing research on the mix of peoples down there. I was writing when there were no written records yet, at least none
Mhm.
that survived, and it was all like legend of, well, my grandmother came here as an escaped slave through the swamp kind of thing.
Yeah.
But documentation that we have is, as I said before, it's the history part that people tend to be surprised by. One of the most useful documents I had when writing the West, there is a fellow, and I'm blanking on his name because it's 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning and I've only had 2 cups of coffee, but he does maps of locations of the native tribes as they were originally, and their original names, the names they called themselves.
Cool.
And I was like, I just threw money at him. I'm like, send me that map. He does beautiful work.
I found a really good one at a museum in Arizona. It's the map of the Old West,
Mhm.
circa like 1983, but then it has a overlay of the modern map.
Mm.
So it's like a transparent with just a detail of the, so you can look to see where you are in modern, flip over and see what it was in 19 or
Yes. I don't know if you can
1883.
see on my wall over there, I've got a map of the US, which is coded. So I use markers on it to trace out like what area I'm working in, what it would have been called, where they're going, where they are in the point of the story. Yeah.
I'll see your map. I'll see your map and raise you the Historical Atlas of Arizona, which goes all the way from prehistory up to.
I think what we're saying here is we do a load of research.
Yeah, good deal of research. Yes.
Yeah. but that's the important thing. I think we're talking about the perils. A lot of the perils of writing this are not necessarily, oh, people are going to be offended, although God knows that happens, whether intentionally or somebody looking to take offense. But it is so easy for us as writers to misstep through ignorance.
Yeah.
And
this is a basic problem in writing anything with a historical basis.
But when we're writing about, especially in the West, when we're writing about cultures that have been erased or that have been harmed or forgotten, as a writer, and I'm only going to say for myself, this is important to me, is that I make as few stupid and harmful mistakes as possible.
First, do no harm.
Yeah, not going to say I'm not going to make any. I made plenty. Yeah. But you try not to. And that gives you back the gift of creating stuff you didn't even know to write about.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And, you know, that's makes it more of a joy than a chore to do the research. Not that for me, research is ever a chore. Sometimes the writing is the hard part.
Do you ever discover things that you've written and then all of a sudden you find there's a historical record that it actually happened?
Oh God, all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or sometimes what happens is you're writing something and you go to check the fact and you're kind of like, I got the right date. Holy shit, I got the right date. Yeah. I don't know whether that's because it was packed in my brain from 4 years of study or I just got lucky, but either way, I'll take it.
And to complement what Laura's saying there, I have a mantra: is always sell them on your reality before you sell them on your fantasy. And I don't remember who first told me that. Heck, it could have been you. But it has been my driving force with writing the Chronicle, is the idea of even though this can be considered alt history or secret history or anything like that, right? And you can take liberties if you need to. I try not to. The most I do is I take some historical characters and I may rewrite them a little bit to fit the situation. I have a story that puts, and it's not in the Drowned Horse, it's actually in a different anthology, but it puts the fictional character from King Solomon's Mines with Kit Carson. And there's no way those two would have ever met, but you can play within the holes of history to rewrite some of that stuff. And so, I'll do stuff like that. I have a story with a guy who was called the Emperor of Arizona, and I'm actually changing it so it's not all of Arizona, it's just Drowned Horse. And, because I don't want to go that big because it takes away from the intimacy of the story of that I'm trying to tell. So, yeah.
Yeah, the way I put it is 3 truths and a lie. You give them 3 truths and then you give them the lie, and if you weave them in properly, nobody can tell which is which.
Right.
It's all part of suspension of disbelief and the structure that you build, so that the reader doesn't go, "Hey, wait, what?" but just kind of accepts it all and moves on. Yeah, and when you're writing something that people think they know, if you're writing a second world fantasy, you can make crap up and everybody's gonna be like, "All right, they made it up." Writing history in a fantastical element, specifically recent history, by which I mean you're not going to prehistoric, you're not going to Romans or Greeks or whatever, of more than 2,000 years ago or however many. People think they know. In many cases, people do know. If you get it wrong, or if you get it egregiously wrong, it destroys the story. If you get a place wrong where somebody lives, they can be like, this person doesn't know what they're talking about.
But you can also get it right and not say what people think happened.
Right.
And people will call you out for that.
And sometimes I correct them, and sometimes I'm just like, okay, whatever.
My friend Tamsin Silver writes historical fantasy with Billy the Kid.
Billy the Kid, great books.
Yeah, and does an amazing amount of research on Billy and all of the characters surrounding. And there's always somebody who tries to tell her that, oh, you don't know Billy the Kid, but she put in the legwork. She moved to New Mexico to make sure that the lake, well, no, she fell in love with the place, but the amount of research she does for her books is incredible. It actually pales in comparison.
Now I'm wondering how many authors actually end up living in places they do research, because that's how I ended up in Seattle.
Yeah.
I came out here to do research for mystery series that I ended up setting in Seattle. I was auditioning Seattle and Portland for the books, fell in love, and like a year later moved out here.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure it happens. Yeah. I'm the reverse. I got moved to Arizona and then decided to set my books there. So
well, as long as you're here, you might as well do the research locally. Yeah.
I as well.
Yeah. Well, the geography of the West is huge, and that brings up the question of how do you focus down? And Laura Ann, you talked about the need for boots on the ground, actually getting to the place and seeing what it looks, feels, smells, how it all works. How do you pick which place?
There's an in-joke in Silver on the Road. If you actually look at a map, where Flood, the town where the devil lives, is situated, is the geographical center of the lower 48. I specifically chose that spot as sort of an in-joke shout out, both for my geology nerds and for my supernatural fandom nerds, and they know why. but I that was my starting point. And from there, I was just like, okay, and we're going to expand. I had limits of what I could cover because that was the Louisiana Purchase, which is massive, not just Louisiana, obviously.
Yeah.
But those were my boundaries. That was where I could tell the stories. And it was fun because everything within that territory I could create, but everything outside was the actual history as was happening, and that was influencing what was happening inside the territory. Because apparently, I don't like doing it easy. But that was my playground, the limits of the actual purchase.
That's not very limited, as you say.
Well, it gave me a lot of room to play, but it also gave me restrictions. And again, I had to integrate what was happening in Washington, D.C., the decisions that were being made by the U.S. government, the decisions that were being made by the Spanish government. So, yeah.
For me, like I said, I lived in the Verde Valley, and I named my town Drowned Horse to change the name of the town I was actually living in, because I did not want the people who might read this book to think I was saying their town was cursed, even though I sort of felt that way living there. But yeah, the Verde Valley is a very interesting place within Arizona. There's, first of all, it's almost like a bowl. It's the greenest part of all of Arizona.
Hence Verde.
Yeah, exactly. It actually gets run off now from what we call like Flagstaff, but back then it was the Mogollon Range, and it kind of made this lush oasis in the middle of a desert. So that was fun to play with. And then the idea that, I could set up a certain amount of boundary for the curs, even though occasionally things expand beyond it, just as the nature of things are. But for the most part, it is centered in this cursed land, and why it's cursed and so forth. It just kind of gave me a natural boundary to work within. Of course, the hard part is when you're, and I'm sure Laura's gone through this as well, is tracking the names of places as they have changed so many times throughout history. And then somebody will name someplace else in the state the same name of something that was named in your area. So like the Black Mountain, there's like 3 Black Mountains in Arizona. And I had to finally figure out which mountain in the Verde Valleys was Black Mountain, which turned out to be Magnus Mountain, the most obvious.
Usually it's the most obvious.
Yeah, it made sense when I finally found out, but it's not like it's the only mountain in the area. There's a lot of them. So, because we're talking northern Arizona, which is in itself different than what we think about with Arizona, with the deserts and so forth. I mean, there was a ski resort in Arizona, right up in Flagstaff. We don't think about Arizona having snow, but northern Arizona gets a lot of snow.
It's got a lot of mountains and
yeah. So it's go ahead.
I didn't actually have that much issue, mainly because, as I said, I was working in an area that had not been surveyed. So the names were those given by the local tribes, which sadly, most of them have not survived. This was the Devil's West books specifically were written around early 1800s. At that point, again, not many white folk had actually gotten there officially. The records that were kept were not generally written down, were almost none of them were in English or translated into English. So I was mainly going on stories. And one of the things I did when researching was read as many of the legends and stories as I could find told by native speakers in English, obviously, which had two elements. One is you get this very interesting feel for different mythologies. Also, I discovered changed a little bit of how I wrote in terms of rhythm. Because, and I think this probably anybody who gets their mindset out of traditional Western white writing will find that every culture has a different rhythm to their storytelling. And I even retelling Jewish myths and stories, we get a slightly different rhythm. And I found that that was kind of like seeping into my writing, which was very interesting. So I didn't really have that problem with names. I could rename everything with glee and abandon, mainly because I didn't have the documents to work from. And I didn't want to use the names that the white surveyors had given it.
So speaking of names that white surveyors give, I don't know if you guys know Dave Butler, DJ Butler, but he writes westerns, a little bit, not old West, but close to modern West, but still historical. And he did a story, and it raised a lot of eyebrows, but it was called The Seven Nipples of Molly Kitchen. The Seven Nipples of Molly Kitchen. Mm-hmm. And what it is a surveyor apparently was in love with a woman named Molly Kitchen. And as he was surveying the Utah area, every time he saw a mountain, apparently it reminded him of her. And he just named it the Nipple of Molly Kitchen. And so there's 7 of these mountains in Utah named that, which I find utterly hilarious and a great little historical anecdote. So yeah,
I'm sure she was thrilled by this honor.
Oh, I'm sure.
She must have been a cat person because
there you go.
Multiple nipples are.
Yeah,
but I highly recommend it's.
And we wonder where the 8th one is.
Yeah.
No, we don't. We do not wonder.
No,
we are stopping this conversation right now. But I think we've been sort of talking around one element of writing Westerns and weird Westerns, especially because we're talking about supernatural, we're talking about legends, we're talking about mythology, which is the inclusion in the writing of native characters. And I think everybody who approaches Weird West has to make their own decisions how they're going to handle that if they are not native themselves. For me, at least, my choice was not to have primary native characters because I did not believe that I could do it right. And we were talking before about the patterns of speech and mythology and this and that. My comfort level was not there. I included the characters in as widely as was appropriate to the story, which was very appropriate. Mm-hmm. I tried to make sure that I was clear about which tribe, which region they were in, and making sure that I got the right details, clothing, speech, names, that sort of thing. I chose not to do that. I don't know if it was the right choice or the wrong choice. It was the choice I had to make when I was doing those books, though. One of the more fascinating things I did, there was a book of photographs done many, many years ago of members of different tribes across the U.S. And I believe a native photographer is now updating that. And if so, I really need to get my hands on it. But to show the incredibly different physical characteristics, because there's so much cliche there. And that was basically how I tried to approach it, is like acknowledging that these are completely different peoples and integrating that into my characterizations of them, the same as I would for any other culture I was going into. I know that some people have chosen to write native characters feeling that that's how they can create the full story. I don't know, David, what your take on all that was.
So, my novel's a mosaic, which, for the people who don't know what that means, is it's a series of short stories that are interconnected that tell a single narrative. So each chapter could have a different point of view, different protagonist. Some of my protagonists in the story don't make it to the end of the story. Some don't make it to the end of the book. So when I approach each story, I look at who are the best people to represent the story I want to tell. So far, out of all the drowned horse stories I've written, and I've written parts of volume 2 and 3 already, I've only had two primary Native American points of view. One of them in the first volume is from a child. And I feel like children are the same to a certain extent, regardless of race. I think that that's important to understand that children don't show up having the same prejudices and the same fears that adults do, right? Kids are kids.
You've
And I
got to
wanted
be
to,
carefully taught.
yeah.
Mhm.
And so, there's an element of childlike um, wonder and adventure in that story that it would be the same regardless of who the protagonist was. And then I decided to do something which I thought was very clever. I don't know, somebody would have to read it and tell me, is how we've portrayed the Native Americans always speaking in broken English. Well, the language in the area is called human, and the child, from when it's his point of view, Martha is his name. When a white person's trying to talk to him in his language, it's broken human. Which I thought was very funny for me. I don't know. Well, in the grand scale of things, we'll have to see how that is. But overall, when approaching the Native Americans, first of all, in the Verde Valley, it's very difficult because the Yavapai tribe is not one tribe; it's
Mhm.
several broken up.
Mhm.
You got you got the Yavapai, you got the Yavapai, you got the Willikupai. There is so many different versions of the Yavapai, and then of course you have the Apache. And there are some tribes that are intermixed, like the Tonto Apache, and so forth, right? So you've got all of these different, and each one of them has its own identity. So much like what you were talking about, I had to make sure that when I was dealing with one particular aspect of the Yavapai, that I was dealing with that particular. Some are more aggressive than others, some are much more friendlier, and so forth. How I approached the whole topic, though, the overall arc, is in my first volume. I have a sheriff, and the sheriff is Romani. He's what we used to call a gypsy. And so he's very used to having his people driven from areas. And so he comes into this area when he becomes the sheriff with a innate almost sympathy or empathy for what's happening to the natives in the area. So he's always straddling this line of being, my job is to protect the settlers, but I'm not going to do it at the cost of a people who are clearly being screwed. And it's a line he's always walking through the first volume. So yeah.
It's
Did
interesting
that
what you
answer the
said about,
question?
and just what you said about kids. I keep referring back to the story Boots of Clay because I was working through a lot of complicated thoughts when I was writing the story. And that there are children who are just encountering somebody different from them for the first time, and somebody vastly different, not just Western cowboys, but observant Jews whose traditions are vastly different, and yet at the same time had a weird kind of overlap. And yeah, kids are great for that sort of thing. I disagree that kids are kids no matter what, in that we are formed by our cultures from infancy. And there are definitely things that even by the time you're 5 or 6, you're differentiating.
Okay, that's valid.
But being able to see how an adult deals with a child of a different culture versus an adult of that different culture was one of the ways that I was able to show both the differences and the overlaps. I'm sorry, I talk a lot with my hands. I apologize.
There's no problem with that. They're visible on the screen.
Yeah. And believe me, if I wasn't so tired, I'd probably be more animated as well. No, you make a valid point. Obviously, especially when we get into the later era of the Old West, when we start getting into the 1880s, yeah, their parents are telling them right from, as soon as they can understand what to be scared of, what to be prepared for, and so forth. Absolutely, there is that. I guess what I think about when I say a statement like that is you can put, white children playing in a creek with Native American children, and they're just children having fun. They're just playing. They're not necessarily looking at each other as one as an enemy, when they're younger.
I think maybe we're talking at different angles. Of what I was talking about was in terms of just our belief structures.
Oh, yeah. Well,
there's going to be confusion. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be what are you talking about kind of thing. There's not the instantaneous understanding that we assume all children have, past the I'm going to splash you with water, you splash me with water kind of thing that you were talking about.
Right.
Yeah. But that
differentiation of how girl children are treated versus boy children.
Yeah. That conflict is what makes the story happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The conflict and the resolution of confusion. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with everything you're saying. Absolutely.
Oh no, agreement. Conversation killer.
Quick, throw another question at us.
Something hot that we can just
So how do you, given that you're working with a cultural period which is so fraught with minefield, it's a minefield. There are so many ways to do something wrong. How do you know when you got it right?
Silence. If you get it right, there's silence. If you get it wrong, there's a lot of noise. Honestly, I don't know that you ever can, because history is seen through a lens, and everybody's lens is different. And no history can be right because it's history. It's not the moment, which sounds like I'm caging, and I guess possibly I am. But as a student of history, the first thing you have to acknowledge is what you know. Yes, it's facts, but it is the story that has been woven around those facts.
Yeah.
And in the story that we call history, there's a lot of bullshit. And there's a lot of stuff that is a wrong conclusion. And I always joke, the example I always give is from archaeology. And probably people have heard this before, but if archaeologists don't know what something is, it's a ritual implement.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a household tool they discover afterwards, or sometimes it's a sex toy. They've also discovered that afterwards. But we default to certain things. And that is true until such a time as we learn it's not. And that's how I think you can't really get anything 100% right when you're writing historical fiction, whether it's fantastical or straight. So you just do the best you can and wait for people to yell at you.
So knowledge is fractal, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Is that as you zoom in, you discover that things are not what you thought they were. And then zoom in again and you discover, oh, wait a minute, they were.
Yeah.
And that there's always a level where it becomes there's no such thing as a fact. There are just levels of truth.
There's no such thing as a single fact.
Yeah, a single fact. Some relationships are clearly true.
We do the best that we can. And when we get published by, good publishers, they're going to run stuff by people, right? First, you've got an editing process. And if you have a good editor who understands the history you're writing in, they're going to call you out on things that don't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get to prove them wrong by actually showing them the documentations and things like that, which has so far only happened once. But, and then, the idea of sensitivity readers is a hot button issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, some publishers have them, some people don't. And then I've also heard when I was at a conference that the sensitivity readers that one particular publisher had were just some college interns.
Max, shut up. Sorry about that. Max, hush.
Okay.
And now you've all
Max
heard
is
my
being
dog.
a sensitivity reader.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a Zoom call without a
Max.
dog barking or a
Max, come
child
on, good
crying.
girl. Somebody obviously walked by.
Yeah. But no, I mean, that some of the sensitivity readers don't really have any idea what it is that they're reading for, and they're just basing it on what they think is politically correct. And so you've got this balance, you've got all of this different stuff that's going on behind the scenes. And you hope that when you turn it over to your publisher, that if you've made any glaring mistakes, that somebody in the process will catch it before it becomes a meme.
Yeah.
But that's not always the case, right?
You always want to say to your publisher, please get me a copy editor who knows this crap.
Yeah.
I want you all to know I'm working very hard to keep my language PG rated. I'm from New Jersey. It's hard.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it's Sunday morning. I'm sure God is happy.
God has more to worry about.
I was going to say, okay, here we have a cultural dissonance here because no, Sabbath is on Saturday. Sunday, God doesn't care. We can fight about that.
That's valid. That's valid.
I always say it's like, this is the specialization. The project I'm working on right now for Simon & Schuster is actually it's historical fiction, but it's set in the early 19 teens. And I'm like, please find a copy editor who actually understands, among other things, labor history. And they did, bless them. Mm-hmm. You have to say, all right, this is the detail that I need somebody to look at. Now, I know that a lot of publishers are using sensitivity readers. I firmly believe that the writer should be hiring them or bribing them or however you're convincing them to do work for you before it even goes to the editor. Right. That is on us to say, okay, let me make sure that I'm doing this right before it even goes into the process or concurrently with your editors. No,
having good first readers, that are within the cultures that you're writing about. Yeah, if you can, right? It sometimes it's really hard. Finding, for me specifically, I've had a great deal of difficulty finding Native American first readers.
It's almost impossible. They understandably want nothing to do with this. And you have to respect that. If they say, no, I don't want to talk to you, or no, I'm not going to pass along this information, you're like, okay. And then you find another way around it. You find some other way to tell the story.
Yeah.
Again, my take on it.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, there is sometimes you just like, okay, I'm going to make stuff up then. You have to acknowledge the fact that somebody is going to be pissed off about that, or somebody's going to think that you're reporting something that's real. Yeah. It's fiction, people. In the end, it's fiction. It's fantasy. There's only so much.
Yeah, like tribal leaders, right? Like I have some real tribal leaders, But overall, most of the tribal leaders are footnotes in history at best. And so I have to make up tribal leaders between other tribal leaders, where I can find a person who would actually be there doing this thing at this time. I need another person who was there for another time that there's no record of history in history of who that person was. And then I have to make them up. And I hope that I've made an amalgam of, my research into the decision making of the tribal leaders. I have a book. Is it over here? Did I pick the office? It's just wisdom given by tribal leaders, right, to their people, messages that they gave or things that they said in interviews and so forth. And you can start kind of understanding the decision process that certain tribal leaders made during these incredibly difficult and horrific times. So, yeah.
I had it a little bit easier in that, as I said, the Devil's West novels specifically take place pre-written English records. So there are names, but the names, again, what somebody was called within their own tribe is not necessarily what another tribe called them.
Right.
And that's always that's one of the reasons I tried very hard to use the names of the tribes that they called themselves, because a lot of times the names another tribe called them were not polite. Kind of like, Yankee fans versus Red Sox fans. Sorry about that. It's the name of the team. They haven't changed it yet. And so I got to basically say, nobody actually knows who the leaders were. We only have the stories of what happened. So I can elide that and basically be like talking about an event without talking about the person. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a cheat. It was also harder.
Well, and if I can bring up, go ahead.
In any case, with that, there wasn't a leader. There was a person who was taking the function of leading.
Yes, and that is an incredibly important part. A lot of what we assume as chieftain or leader or whatever was leading or was responsible for a certain portion of that society.
For a certain portion of time.
Yeah. And other people were doing other things. Yeah.
A lot of the tribes were actually led by women until we moved west, and the cavalry kind of forced, like the cavalry would not deal with a woman. And so they're like, give us a man to speak for your tribe. And so they would pick somebody, and then he was the pseudo leader, even though the woman was making the decisions. And eventually we see this shift to more and more war chiefs and things like that, because that's the only people that the cavalry or the U.S. government felt that they could actually deal with, actually talk with, which is, just another horrible thing we did.
That's an example of what gets recorded rather than what happens.
Yeah. I have a really good book I highly recommend called The People. I don't know if you've read that one. The People. It was actually my college textbook. I took Native American history in college, and The People was our textbook, and it's an amazing book for looking at the tribes across the country, and the reality of what happened to them.
I'm just going to bump in here because I noticed in the chat, ask if anybody mentioned Tony Hillerman yet. We haven't, mainly because he was writing 20th century, a little bit later than what we're talking about here. But yeah, Tony did his research, not always perfectly, but as I understand it, he got a lot of stuff right. Something's wrong, and follow the books, not any media presentation thereof. That's all I'm going to say on that matter.
But I know we're getting close to the end of time, but since you posed something, I want to pose something back. Talk about your mythology. What are the creatures that you decided to use in your series that fits so well with this idea of the Weird Western?
I had a lot of fun creating the monsters. In that every creature that I have that they come across is based in actuality. It's been enough years; it's not really a spoiler. One of the monsters in one of the books is a giant otter, which sounds, oh, it's not that bad. They're huge and they're scary and they will kill people. And I just made them a little bit bigger. Again, I took them out of actual natural nature creatures, animals that they would have encountered or outside of that area would have encountered, and moved them into the territory and added magic. But everything was part of the natural world, because in the Devil's West, the supernatural is part of the natural world. This is completely normal for them. And anything I could find mythology of, for example, firebirds. Okay, what would a firebird actually be like in the natural world? What would it look like? What would it do? What purpose would it serve in nature? And then I added it in. So it was a lot of zoology that I was marrying to mythology to create the monsters.
Well, and with me, there's a lot of records of creatures that are either extinct now or were never really there. But like there's not even Lewis and Clark, but other expeditions describe dragons on the Mississippi.
There were
right?
dinosaurs, and I actually got to use pterodactyls.
Mm-hmm. So some of those little cracks in history are fun to play with. For me, I especially wanted to make sure, because I'm going with this whole cultural spin, that I looked at the mythologies, and when I dove into the mythologies, I wanted to pick monsters that played to the human weaknesses, the human fears, the sins, the things that we hide. And that's where we built these monsters from originally in the mythology. It's like, oh, a child disappears. Oh no, that wasn't somebody in the village who kidnapped that child. No, it was a fairy, a sprite. It was something like that. We built these so that these inner sins have some place, some mythological reason, right? And I play up that in the Old West because, like I said, we took those fears with us.
I'm going to make an apology to the people in the feed. I hadn't realized that going full screen completely cut off the feed, so I wasn't noticing the things that people were saying. There's been some great comments.
I've been watching them scroll by, but we've been kind of like going off and off.
Yeah, I didn't see them either. Same thing here. Hi, everybody.
So I now know better. I will not do that in the future. Are there any questions from the audience that they would like addressed in the next minute? And then we'll have David and Laura-Ann sort of wrap up. Give people a second to write.
I apologize to the person whose dog got set off by Max going off. I apologize to your neighbors also.
Yes, people are talking about otters a lot.
Yeah. Oh, let me tell you, those otters, the giant ones, are terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. Mm-hmm. Making one into a monster was a misunderstood monster was quite a lot of fun.
Yes, Dale, to your question, yes, or statement. It is like a weird Western Pulp Fiction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, wrap up. Any final comments, David or Laura-Ann?
Well, actually, I have a question before you let him wrap up.
Okay.
Because you talked a little about your research, the process. I'll just share an example of odd research that showed up that gave me a whole different perspective. We've all heard of Billy the Kid, down in the Arizona, New Mexico. I was reading a little bit, and I don't know if you've ever read this, but you know what the 1880 census showed his occupation as? Handyman. So I have this vision that's going to show up in a book somewhere that I have Billy the Kid cleaning out my chicken.
So there's a
Remember, these people existed outside of that 30 minutes of shooting people. They ate, they drank, they pooped, they dated. So just I had to ask you, what was the oddest little bit of trivia that you guys came across when you're doing all your research?
Oh God. Oddest bit.
Well, this Emperor of Arizona is the newest one for me. This guy was a con artist, and through a very elaborate series of ruses, almost convinced the American government that his pseudo wife owned the Arizona and part of New Mexico territory through a land grant, and nearly got the entire the whole area turned over to him. And so much, it was so believable that mining barons and so forth were paying him for land rights and things of that nature. It is one of the most convoluted and incredible cons I've ever read about. And it actually got turned into a movie with a very young and surprisingly handsome Vincent Price as the lead. But it's crazy what you could make believable in that time period. And real quick to Dale, generally 3. That to answer your question on that. I'll see if I can answer the Facebook user before we end. Okay, go ahead, Laura.
The weirdest or most unusual bit of history I learned, complete tangent while I was doing research, was the relationship of the church and the Spanish government in what became Mexico, which didn't have much impact on the story and yet also had a huge impact on the story because the politics of the outside world were pressing in on the territory. But it kind of upended a lot of what I thought I knew about the Spanish government and their influence on colonialism, on immigration, and changed a little bit how I viewed the church at the time. And it's so much more complicated than we're taught, and so many different parts to the movement that I was just like, I have to stop hating on some things and start hating on other things. And I have to work my way around that. But there was an awful lot of politics going on that were absolutely fascinating, that would take another hour to unpack. So we're not going to do that.
I want to answer something to the Facebook user who asked about indigenous languages. So you're absolutely right. What you describe about speaking their language, eating their food, dancing at their celebrations. I've
done 2 of the 3. I have no skill at languages, and I acknowledge this, but I've done 2 of the 3.
The first thing I always recommend is reaching out to the tribes. They all have a website where you can reach out. When I first started writing the Yavapai people, I reached out. They sent me a packet this thick of information on them. And then also, doing the research, finding translations and so forth. I actually found this one. It says Speak Yavapai Now. It's really kind of almost a children's book, but that led me to the authors of this writing more detailed translation guides and so forth. So Yeah, so it is important.
When in
When
doubt,
I
always start at the stuff written for kids.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes,
Writers are like
so
children in that regard. Start us slow.
yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell you one of the things that I've been doing. I'm working on a novel. It's got some current Lakota Ogala um, uh, people in it, and I have to say one of the most useful research tools I found is I subscribe to the local paper, and it's because they have features on local writers, local artists, local history, and as well as current. And it's kind of hard to get political when you're writing about the sports team, and you get a real perspective on how things are
That's
seen.
a really important point that we didn't touch on, and we should have, is always, 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 the history major speaking, go to your most primary source.
News.
You can't avoid politics because everything is political in some way. But you can get the most direct story, which is like the advice for anybody. Just go to your primary sources.
I highly recommend a subscription to newspapers.com if you're going to dive into research, because all of the newspapers are starting to put their archives, their microfiche and so forth online, and newspapers.com has access to all of these small papers that were not around for very long, got absorbed by big papers. They still have those papers in the archives and so forth. In volume 2 of The Drowned Horse, one of my characters is a newspaper man. And so I'm doing research on how the news worked during that time period in Arizona. And there's several really good books on it as well. So yeah, if you can afford an occasional, subscription to something like that, or
check your local library.
Or check your local library.
Or your online library. The New York
That'll help you find what you want.
Yeah, New York Public Library had amazing access for me.
Yeah.
Okay, Tom, you better let them close out now, because I got one more question for you after they do.
Okay. Anything you want to say in closing?
David, you start, because I opened up.
Okay. This Tuesday, I have a Kickstarter for a comic book that I wrote with Kevin J. Anderson called Trivalent Rising. And it is basically giant mechs in a post-kaiju society used for anger management therapy. And it's got great art. It's from Outland Entertainment. And that's the biggest thing I have going right now, is that Kickstarter. Also, like I said, Volume 1 came out in October of The Drowned Horse Chronicle. If you like what we're talking about with the Weird West, want to see it in practice, this is a lot of fun because it's a mosaic. You can just get in and out of chapters and get on with your life and come back to it later. So that's what I got going on right now. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming.
I've got 3 things. One, the story that I referenced a couple of times, Boots of Clay, is in this collection, West Wind's Fool and Other Stories of the Devil's West, including the story that became Silver on the Road, for those of you who've read the novel. The second thing is, if you are interested in a slightly different take on Weird West, my Patreon, we are currently doing a serialized novel that I describe as the movie The Frisco Kid meets Thelma and Louise, only with magic. So you can join that and read along with everybody else. And the third thing is, it's not Western, but it is historical. My book Uncanny Times is set in the 19-teens, monster hunting on the East Coast. And the next book, you can't really see the postcard here, Uncanny Vows, comes out in November. It's available for pre-order now. That's my commercial, made my editor happy.
I want to tell you that I really liked Uncanny Things. I thought it was a really fun read and interesting, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
I don't seem to have access to the chat, so I can't put the link in, but I just sent it to these guys. So in the notes following this, when it's
Bob can put it in.
yeah. What's that?
Bob has the ability to do that.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I dropped that in the private chat. I dropped the link to the Kickstarter. And there's Laura's Patreon.
Yep.
So yeah, thank you again for having me.
Yes, this has been fun.
Thank you. We'll do it again sometime.
And thanks to
About
everybody
something
who
else.
showed up for the live stream. Always appreciated.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, guys, thank you very much. Tom, can you hang around for a minute after we close?
I certainly can.
For you. And thanks, and we're going away, so